In the chill of November 1970, a crew of tunnel workers vanished beneath the soil of Pennsylvania. One moment, they were carving their way through the bedrock of a city preparing for modern growth, and the next, they were gone, swallowed by darkness, erased from every record that mattered. The city's officials issued vague statements, spoke of an unfortunate accident, and moved on. Families buried empty coffins, neighbors whispered, and slowly the story slipped into silence, buried under years of progress and asphalt. Yet the truth never left the ground where it had been sealed. Before we dive into this chilling true mystery, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that reveal the hidden past. By 2005, the memory of those vanished men was little more than a faded rumor, shared in hushed voices by aging relatives. But for Detective Michael Turner, the case was more than rumor. It was a puzzle. Turner, 45 years old, had spent over 2 decades inside the Philadelphia Police Department, working through robberies, assaults, and endless paperwork. He had once carried ambition like a torch, but now it felt as though the flame had dimmed, smothered by politics and endless orders from above. The world had changed around him. New technology, new officers, new methods. He was still there, heavier around the middle, slower on his feet, and uncertain of his place. That uncertainty was broken the morning a dusty file landed on his desk, its corners curled, the paper brittle with age. It had been pulled from the archives after a city maintenance team stumbled across something strange while repairing old pipelines, a heavy metal door hidden deep underground, sealed with welds thick as scars. The workers reported it, unsure if it belonged to a forgotten utility system or an abandoned tunnel. The file connected the location to a tragedy recorded in 1970, the disappearance of the crew that had been officially written off as dead. Turner read the old reports with a strange tightness in his chest. The words were clipped, evasive, filled with official language that danced around the facts. Accidental collapse, safety violations, inconclusive recovery. No bodies were recovered. No proper inquiry was conducted. Just an event, closed as quickly as it had begun. He rubbed his tired eyes, his instincts fighting through the years of complacency. A sealed door underground, a group of men gone without trace, a city eager to forget. Something in his bones told him that the truth had been buried, and that discovery wasn't meant to happen. The police department treated the find like an inconvenience, another distraction from real work. But for Turner, it was different. He could almost hear the echoes of men trapped below, their lives reduced to rumor, their families dismissed. It was not only a mystery, it was an injustice that had outlived everyone who could have been held responsible. As he pushed the file across his cluttered desk, Turner felt a current stir within him, faint but undeniable. He hadn't felt that pull in years, the pull of a case that mattered. And though he didn't yet know where it would lead, he sensed that opening the door meant opening wounds the city had chosen to forget. The story was no longer buried. It was knocking, waiting for someone stubborn enough to answer. And Michael Turner, weary but unbroken, was about to listen. The year was 1970, and the air carried the restless hum of change. Factories clanged from sunrise to dusk, and the promise of new infrastructure projects hung over Pennsylvania like banners of progress. The city had approved an ambitious tunnel meant to improve transportation and feed commerce. For men like Frank Doyle, the foreman, the work meant stability and pride. He was 38, with broad shoulders hardened by years underground, and a reputation for protecting his crew as fiercely as his own kin. Among the men he guided was Samuel "Sammy" Ortiz, barely 22, son of Puerto Rican immigrants. Sammy carried an eagerness that clashed with the weary patience of the older workers. He dreamed of proving himself, of sending money back to his family who believed America still held boundless opportunity. Frank saw in him both youth's recklessness and its promise, and often tempered his ambition with steady words. "Slow your hands, kid," Frank muttered one evening as they drilled into damp stone. "This tunnel isn't a race, it's about rhythm." "Stone doesn't forgive mistakes." Sammy grinned, sweat dripping from his brow, and replied, "Guess I'll let rhythm teach me then." Frank shook his head, half in irritation, half in pride. Overseeing from above ground, a young journalist named Eleanor Hayes recorded her notes in a leather-bound journal. She wasn't convinced the city had been honest about safety conditions. She'd heard whispers in diners and union halls, corners cut, inspections rushed, officials looking the other way. She watched the men descend each morning, their faces streaked with dust before the first hour passed, and wondered how much the city valued their lives compared to the profit promised by finishing early. By late summer, the air inside the tunnel grew heavy, dust and damp mingling until it clung to every breath. The men worked by the glow of harsh lamps, the rumble of machines echoing like distant thunder. Then, one afternoon, the ground itself roared. A violent shudder tore through the passage. Walls groaned. The ceiling split with a crack like gunfire. "Out!" "Out now!" Frank shouted, shoving Sammy and others toward the exit shaft. But the tunnel shook again, this time with terrifying force. A section of the ceiling crashed down, blocking the path. Darkness surged with dust and falling rock. The men scrambled, coughing, voices shouting in panic. Then silence, a suffocating silence broken only by muffled cries. On the surface, alarms blared, rescue teams rushed, and families gathered at the site. Eleanor pushed through the crowd, notebook in hand, desperate for details. Yet what followed was not frantic rescue, but hesitation. Officials barked orders to halt digging, claiming structural instability. Hours turned to days. Mothers clutched children, wives pleaded for answers, and every delay deepened despair. By the end of the week, the city declared the workers lost. No bodies recovered, no funerals held, only shallow explanations and sealed-off entrances. Eleanor's pen shook as she wrote, "Declared dead without proof, buried without graves." She caught fragments of rumors, bribes exchanged, corners cut, officials eager to end the matter before questions grew. The men had vanished into stone, their families left with nothing but grief and suspicion. The tunnel that had promised progress was now a scar, sealed and forgotten. And in that silence, whispers began to spread. Maybe it wasn't an accident at all. The aftermath of the tunnel collapse spread like a shadow over the small industrial town. Families who had once relied on the steady paychecks of the workers now faced silence at the dinner table and empty chairs that would never be filled. Widows were approached by city representatives carrying envelopes of compensation checks and whispered instructions to accept the tragedy, move forward, and not press questions that could never be answered. Some, desperate for survival, signed their names with trembling hands. Others tore the papers apart, refusing to let money erase the lives of their husbands, fathers, and sons. Children clung to their mothers' skirts outside city offices, listening to conversations that ended in slammed doors and muffled sobs. A boy asked, "Mama, when is Daddy coming home?" and received no answer, only the hollow echo of grief, too heavy to carry. The families wanted closure, but instead they received polished speeches about unforeseeable accidents and heroic sacrifices. For many, the words rang empty. Eleanor Hayes, still only in her late 20s, refused to let the story die. With her notebook full of observations and questions, she went door to door, speaking to wives who held onto their husbands' boots like relics and children who remembered the sound of their father's laughter fading into memory. She discovered inconsistencies, dates in the city's reports that didn't align, rescue logs missing hours, and a set of safety inspection documents signed days after the collapse had already occurred. When Eleanor attempted to publish her findings, the editorial board of her paper blocked her, citing liability concerns. One editor leaned across his desk, eyes heavy with warning. "You've done good work, Eleanor, but you're stirring the wrong pot. These people have power, you don't." His words only fueled her determination, though she now understood the risks. In diners across town, whispers of conspiracy mixed with the smell of fried food and coffee. Some claimed the collapse had been intentional, others that the workers had been buried to hide evidence of unsafe practices. Men lowered their voices when union officials entered, and conversations died when city contractors sat at nearby tables. Suspicion grew like weeds in cracked pavement, silent yet persistent. The widows formed small groups, gathering in kitchens over strong coffee and shared sorrow. Some wanted justice, others only peace, but all agreed the city had given them neither. One woman, her hands trembling as she held a faded photograph, told Eleanor, "They think because we're poor we'll forget, but I will not forget." Yet with every question Eleanor raised, pressure mounted. Her phone rang late at night with silence on the other end. Her landlord hinted that her lease might not be renewed. Strangers lingered too long near her apartment. The message was clear: keep quiet. Still, she wrote, filling notebook after notebook with names, dates, and fragments of testimony. She knew the story was bigger than a collapse. It was about the value of human lives measured against the weight of money and politics. The more she uncovered, the more isolated she became, yet the fire inside her refused to dim. By winter's first snow, the families had grown weary of fighting. Many accepted their losses in silence, forced by circumstance. Eleanor stood almost alone, pen in hand, her determination a small flame against the encroaching dark. And as the town slowly turned its gaze away, she understood that the truth was slipping beneath layers of fear and forgetting. But deep down, she also knew it would resurface. It always did. By 2005, the Philadelphia Police Department felt less like a place of justice and more like a factory of routine for Detective Michael Turner. The old brick building hummed with the clatter of keyboards and the distant buzz of fluorescent lights, but the excitement that had once driven him had long since drained away. Younger officers in sharp suits hurried past with sleek laptops and digital tools, while Turner sat surrounded by worn files, his desk cluttered with paper, coffee stains, and an ashtray he no longer used. He often wondered if the world had quietly moved past him. At 45, Turner carried himself with the heaviness of a man who had seen too much without ever making enough of a difference. His marriage had dissolved years earlier. His teenage daughter barely spoke to him, and his once bright ambitions had dulled into the grind of closing minor cases. Still, there remained a stubborn core inside him, the piece that refused to let him retire quietly into irrelevance. He just needed something that mattered. That something arrived on a grey afternoon when an intern from the records office dropped a dust-coated folder on his desk. "They found something downtown," the intern muttered, before hurrying off. Turner flipped open the file and frowned at the brittle, yellowed pages. It was a case he had only heard whispered about, the 1970 tunnel collapse. He read the old reports carefully, each word tightening his chest. There were inconsistencies everywhere, pages that should have been detailed reduced to vague statements, rescue efforts glossed over, families' testimonies missing. The collapse had been officially labeled an accident, but there was no evidence of a proper investigation. The more Turner read, the more he sensed deliberate avoidance. Later that evening, he overheard two city engineers in the hallway discussing something unusual. Their crew, while repairing pipelines beneath the streets, had discovered a thick steel door hidden in the depths, welded shut, heavy, old. They had reported it, unsure if it connected to any active system. Turner froze, his mind leaping back to the file. The coordinates matched. He pressed one of the engineers for details. "It doesn't make sense," the man said, shaking his head. "It's not on any of our maps. Who seals a passage that deep underground?" Turner didn't answer. His gut told him this was no forgotten utility tunnel. Back at his desk, he stared at the folder. For decades, the city had let the memory of those missing workers fade into dust. Now, after 35 years, something tangible had resurfaced. Turner felt a spark he hadn't known in years, an urgency, a purpose. But with the spark came unease. If the city had hidden the truth once, what would they do now that the past was clawing its way back to light? He leaned back in his chair, the hum of the office fading as his mind turned over the possibilities. For the first time in years, he felt alive, and with that came the quiet certainty that he was about to step into something dangerous. The sealed door waited in silence, a threshold between the forgotten and the unforgiven. And Turner, weary yet resolute, knew he couldn't walk away. The discovery of the sealed passage stirred only unease among city officials, not curiosity. When the construction crew first reported it, their supervisors ordered the site closed off within hours. Official statements called it a structural hazard, insisting further exploration was too risky. But Detective Turner couldn't ignore the way the door had been welded shut, as if someone had wanted to bury not only rock, but also secrets. He stood in the damp underground chamber with 2 engineers, his flashlight beam cutting across the heavy slab of steel. The welds were thick and deliberate, the edges blackened as though torches had burned them into permanence. Turner ran his fingers along the cold metal, feeling its silence press against him. "This wasn't sealed for safety," he muttered. One of the engineers glanced at him nervously and replied, "Then why?" Turner had no answer, only a growing certainty that what lay behind the door mattered more than the city wanted anyone to believe. Back at headquarters, he tried to push for access, but the request was drowned in bureaucracy. "Resources are limited, Detective," his captain said, eyes fixed on paperwork. "We're not chasing ghosts from 30 years ago. Drop it." Turner's jaw tightened, but he nodded, at least outwardly. Inside, he felt the old frustration ignite. He knew the difference between an accident and a cover-up, and this smelled of the latter. That night he sat in a diner near South Street, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee while reading over the file again. His thoughts were interrupted by a voice. "You're digging into the tunnel case, aren't you?" Turner looked up to see a woman in her early 30s with sharp eyes and a press badge clipped to her coat. She introduced herself as Lisa Chen, a reporter with a reputation for chasing stories others avoided. "You're not the first cop to stumble on this," she said, sliding into the booth across from him. "But you might be the first who doesn't look ready to quit." Turner raised a brow. "And what's your angle?" Lisa leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Truth. The city's been hiding something since 1970, and that door proves it." Turner studied her for a long moment, wary of journalists but recognizing the fire in her determination. He saw in her what he had once carried himself, the refusal to let silence win. "If we do this," he said slowly, "we're not just poking a hornet's nest, we're ripping it open." Lisa smirked faintly. "Then let's hope neither of us is allergic." As the night deepened, Turner realized he had found an ally. For years he had buried his instincts under routine, but the sealed door had cracked something open inside him, and now, with Lisa beside him, the pursuit of truth no longer felt like a solitary burden. Still, unease lingered. The door wasn't just metal. It was a warning, a boundary someone long ago had made sure would not be crossed. Turner knew that once they forced it open, metaphorically or otherwise, there would be no turning back. Above ground, the city continued its restless hum, unaware of the secret buried beneath its streets. But for Turner, the sound of progress was already drowned out by the echo of a silence that demanded to be broken. Turner and Lisa began their search with the people who had lost the most. They compiled a list of names from the original crew, 15 men confirmed on duty the day of the collapse. Of those, 8 had left behind families in the city. The rest had scattered, relatives moved away, changed names, or passed on. Their first visit took them to a modest brick home in Kensington, where Maria Ortiz, Sammy's younger sister, still lived. She answered the door with suspicion, her eyes narrowing at Turner's badge and Lisa's press tag. "Why now?" she asked, arms crossed tightly. "You had 35 years." Turner's voice was low. "Because no one asked the right questions back then. We're asking now." Maria hesitated before stepping aside. Inside, her walls were lined with old photographs, family gatherings, holidays, one frame holding a faded picture of Sammy in a hard hat, grinning with pride. "He was just a kid," she said, sitting stiffly on the edge of her couch. "They said it was an accident, but we always knew it wasn't right. My mother cried herself to sleep for years. She wrote letters to the city every month until her hands couldn't hold a pen." Lisa asked gently, "Did anyone from the city ever reach out again?" Maria shook her head. "Only when they sent the check. After that it was like we didn't exist." Their next stop was the north side, where Frank Doyle's widow, Helen, lived in a small apartment above a hardware store. She was older now, her movements slow but her mind sharp. She lit a cigarette with trembling fingers and exhaled slowly. "You know what I remember," she said. "Frank didn't trust the company. He said something smelled wrong, said there were corners being cut, materials that weren't up to code. Turner leaned forward. Did he say anything about who was behind it? Helen nodded. There was a man, city liaison or something, wore expensive suits, always on site. Frank said he was too interested in speed, not safety. Never got his name, but he had this way of making people nervous. Each interview added another piece to the puzzle. A daughter recalled hearing her father arguing with someone on the phone days before the collapse. Another family mentioned seeing men in unmarked cars parked outside their house for weeks afterward, but not everyone was willing to talk. One man, the son of a laborer, opened the door only long enough to say, "Leave it buried. You don't know who you're messing with," before slamming it shut. Turner left each home with a growing sense of weight pressing on his shoulders. These people had carried grief for decades, wrapped in silence and suspicion. Lisa, too, grew quieter after each visit, the reality of the human cost settling heavily around her. One evening, as they walked back to their car under a fading sky, Lisa asked, "What if we can't fix this? What if all we do is stir up pain?" Turner looked up at the clouds, his jaw tight. "Then we give them something they never got, truth, even if it hurts." The more they listened, the clearer it became. The collapse wasn't just a tragedy, it was a betrayal, and the sealed door was no longer just a piece of rusted metal. It was a promise that someone had tried to bury history, but the stories of the families refused to stay buried, and neither would Turner. The city's main library sat like a relic from another era, tall stone pillars, quiet marble halls, and the scent of aging pages clinging to the air. Turner and Lisa took a table near the back, under a flickering lamp, and began sifting through reels of microfilm, dusty public records, and faded newspaper clippings. They searched for building permits, tunnel blueprints, safety inspection reports, anything tied to the 1970 project. What they found was chaos. Pages had gaps. Entire sections of documents were missing, sometimes torn, sometimes redacted with thick black ink. "This doesn't make sense," Lisa said, flipping through a brittle ledger. "There should be weekly safety reports." "But there's a 6-week gap before the collapse." Turner nodded grimly. "That's not a mistake. Somebody scrubbed it." They turned to newspaper archives next. Local headlines from the time offered bland updates. Tunnel tragedy claims lives. City mourns loss. Project to resume. But no deep reporting. The coverage stopped cold a week after the incident. Then Lisa spotted something strange. A small column in a lesser-known paper, dated 3 days after the collapse, mentioned protests by workers' families and a police presence near the site. But there was no follow-up. "Look at this," she said, tapping the glass. "There were demonstrations, people demanding answers. Why wasn't this in the major papers?" Turner leaned in. "Because the city didn't want it to be. Keep digging." Hours passed. The windows darkened. They pored over names of contractors, city council members, union bosses, searching for any overlap. And then a name surfaced, Brennan and Hollis Engineering, listed as a subcontractor on the tunnel project. "I know that name," Turner muttered. "They were fined in the early 80s. Unsafe materials, bribery charges. They vanished after that." Lisa traced the paper trail and found something else. Donations. Brennan and Hollis had contributed heavily to a city councilman's campaign in 1969. That same councilman later pushed legislation fast-tracking the tunnel's approval. They stared at each other in silence, the implications forming without words. By midnight, their eyes burned from reading, but one thing was certain. There had been more than negligence. A network of influence, money, and silence had buried the truth. "We're not chasing a forgotten accident," Turner said. "We're chasing a machine that was built to protect itself." As they packed up, Lisa found one last envelope hidden inside a book on local infrastructure law. Inside were 3 pages, photocopies of what looked like a safety complaint form, unsigned and undated, detailing faulty supports, ignored warnings, and references to outside pressure. She turned to Turner, holding the papers like glass. Someone tried to leave a record. He took the pages, reading slowly. His voice was low. "This isn't just evidence. It's a voice from the past, someone who didn't want it all to disappear." Outside, the city slept under orange sodium lights, but in the quiet corners of that library, the ground was beginning to shift again, not beneath concrete or steel, but under the stories long buried, now clawing their way back to the surface. Lisa returned to her apartment late the next day, her bag filled with copies of notes and library documents. She placed them carefully on her desk, scanning through them one more time. Something still felt missing. She stared at a photograph taped above her monitor. Eleanor Hayes from an old university newspaper article titled "The Reporter Who Wouldn't Let Go." The article described Eleanor's early work on the tunnel story. There were quotes, brief mentions of resistance she faced, and a line about her departure from journalism in 1972 after a disagreement with her editors. Lisa had always wondered what happened to her. Digging through online archives and city registries, Lisa finally located an address linked to Eleanor, an old house in the outskirts of Chestnut Hill. That weekend, she and Turner drove out, the streets narrowing and trees thickening as they approached a weathered two-story home, nestled behind overgrown hedges. They knocked, unsure what they'd find. A woman in her 70s answered the door. Her face was pale, her voice quiet. "I know why you're here," she said before they could speak. Eleanor hadn't forgotten a thing. She invited them in, her living room cluttered with books, boxes, and the stale scent of old paper. As she poured tea, Turner noticed framed newspaper clippings on the walls, all unpublished drafts, editorials, and handwritten notes. "I tried," Eleanor said softly. "I wrote everything I could. I interviewed the families, city workers, even one of the engineers who disappeared before I could publish his name." She paused. "Then the threats started." Lisa leaned forward. "Who threatened you?" "A man in a dark suit. Not police, not city, private. He knew where I lived. Told me if I valued peace, I'd drop the story. 2 weeks later, my editor pulled the plug. Said we were risking the paper's future." Turner asked, "Do you still have your notes?" Eleanor nodded slowly, standing up and motioning them to follow her down a narrow hallway. In the back room, boxes lined the walls labeled by year. She pulled out one marked 1970 and opened it with care. Inside were spiral notebooks, photographs, cassette tapes, and dozens of typed pages, many red-stamped with "draft." "I couldn't publish," she said. "But I couldn't throw it away either." As they leafed through her notes, one thing became clear. Eleanor had been close to exposing everything. Her records matched Turner and Lisa's findings, but she had names they didn't: contractors, inspectors, and even a shadowy figure known only by initials, MD, a man who coordinated between city officials and Brennan and Hollis. Lisa's hands trembled as she read. "You were so close," Eleanor smiled sadly. "Closer than they wanted me to be. That's why I disappeared." Turner placed a hand on one of the boxes. This could change everything." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes sharp despite the years. "Then don't let it die again." They left with copies of the most important documents, Eleanor refusing to come forward publicly, her health too fragile, her fear still lingering. But her records were a flame reignited, a voice that had refused to vanish. And with those boxes in their trunk, Turner and Lisa now carried the weight of a truth long silenced, but never lost. Captain Rollins called Turner into his office early Monday morning. The blinds were half closed, casting angled shadows across the desk. Without looking up, Rollins said, "Sit down." Turner remained standing. "I'm guessing this isn't about routine updates." Rollins sighed and finally met his eyes. "I've received multiple calls, from City Hall, from legal." "From the Commissioner's office." Turner didn't flinch. "Then the story's working." "This isn't a joke, Mike," Rollins snapped. "You're poking into things that people very high up don't want touched. You're dragging the department into something we can't win." Turner crossed his arms. "We're supposed to serve the public, not protect a lie." Rollins stood, tension rippling through his voice. "I'm ordering you to stand down. No more investigation, no more contact with the press. If I hear your name connected to this again, you're off the force. Understood?" Turner stared at him, the silence thick between them. Then he turned and walked out without a word. Outside, the station buzzed with activity, phones ringing, radios humming, but Turner felt cold. He knew what was coming, and it still hit hard. Hours later, a formal memo landed on his desk. Administrative leave effective immediately. He packed his things in silence. Younger officers watched from across the room, whispering behind coffee mugs. Some looked curious, others looked afraid. Turner didn't care. He walked out of the building with no regrets, only a deepening resolve. Lisa was waiting in her car. When he climbed in, she handed him a folded newspaper. Her article had just gone live. Sealed Passage, Sealed Truth, A City's Forgotten Workers. The piece laid out everything: the collapse, the sealed door, the missing files, and quotes from families still seeking answers. "You just blew the lid off it," Turner said quietly. Lisa's hands trembled on the steering wheel. "It's not enough. Not yet." By midday, calls poured into the newspaper's office. Families who had remained silent began to speak. A retired city inspector came forward anonymously, claiming he'd been pressured to falsify reports. Photos of the sealed tunnel door circulated online, stirring public outrage. But there was backlash too. The mayor's office released a statement dismissing the article as sensationalism, calling it deeply irresponsible. A spokesperson claimed the collapse had been thoroughly investigated and that revisiting painful history helps no one. Lisa received a warning call that night. A clipped male voice said, "Drop the story. You've done enough damage." She saved the voicemail, her hands shaking. Turner sat in his apartment, watching the city lights flicker beyond the window. He was off the force, facing pressure from every side, but the story was bigger than him now. It had momentum, and it wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about memory, about the voices that had been silenced and the lives dismissed. Lisa called just before midnight. "We're not alone," she said. "People are talking. They're ready to fight back." Turner's voice was steady. "Then let's make sure no one shuts them up again." The sealed door might have stayed closed for 35 years, but the truth behind it had finally begun to break free. The city finally relented. After growing public pressure, officials authorized a limited entry into the sealed passage. But the approval came wrapped in restrictions: no press, minimal personnel, and only 1 hour inside. Turner, still on leave, was granted special clearance as a consultant. Lisa wasn't allowed in, but she waited outside with a recorder in hand and fire in her eyes. Turner suited up alongside a team of 3 structural engineers and 2 firefighters trained in confined space operations. As they descended through the maintenance shaft, the temperature dropped. The air thickened, stale and metallic. Lights flickered against the damp concrete, revealing jagged edges where age and time had gnawed at the structure. The sealed door stood just as Turner had seen it. Steel scorched around the welds, bolts rusted but unbroken. One of the engineers approached with a cutting torch. Sparks hissed into darkness. The metal gave way slowly, screaming as if resisting the intrusion. When the final bolt dropped, Turner pushed the door open. Cold air rushed out, dense and sour, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay and earth long undisturbed. The tunnel beyond lay in shadow, untouched since 1970. They moved carefully, flashlights cutting through the gloom. The walls bore old markings, spray-painted measurements, chalk notes from a different era. Then something caught Turner's eye. A rusted toolbox, half buried under debris. He knelt, brushed the dirt aside, and found initials carved faintly into the lid. F.D. Frank Doyle. Turner opened it. Inside were scattered tools, a flashlight with a cracked lens, and a folded cloth stained by time. Nearby more signs appeared: a thermos, a boot, the shattered remains of a helmet. They continued deeper, and the passage narrowed. A section of the ceiling had collapsed, stone and steel twisted together in a violent mess. They couldn't go further. The lead engineer shook his head. "This whole tunnel is unstable. We shouldn't be in here long." Turner scanned the area again, his flashlight catching something scratched into the wall just before the collapse. He stepped closer, heart pounding. Words, crude, jagged. "They locked us in." His breath caught. He reached for a camera and took photos, documenting everything. The others were silent. One firefighter muttered, "Jesus," and crossed himself. Time was running out. The engineer called for retreat. As they exited, Turner turned back once more, eyes lingering on the message. It wasn't a plea, it was a final truth. A last stand carved in desperation. They resealed the passage behind them, but it didn't matter anymore. What they found couldn't be erased. Above ground, Lisa was waiting. Turner handed her the photos without a word. She looked through them, her expression shifting from curiosity to horror. "That message," she whispered. They knew. They were alive after the collapse. Turner nodded slowly. And someone made sure they'd never get out. The past had spoken, not through whispers but through scratches in stone, buried for decades and now demanding to be heard. The sealed tunnel had become a tomb not of rock, but of silence, and the truth had finally started to breathe. Back at Lisa's apartment, the walls were plastered with printed photos, documents, and hand-drawn timelines. The message on the tunnel wall, "They locked us in," sat at the center, circled in red. Turner paced behind her, the weight of what they had found anchoring every breath. "That wasn't a collapse," Lisa said quietly. "They were sealed in," Turner nodded, "and left to die." The engineer's report confirmed their suspicion. The tunnel showed signs of structural manipulation, evidence that small, controlled charges had likely weakened support beams in the days before the incident. It hadn't been an accident. It had been orchestrated. Turner contacted a retired explosives consultant, a man he trusted from an old case. The expert reviewed the data, photos, and blueprints. His conclusion was grim. "That pattern's not natural," he said over the phone. "You don't get symmetrical buckling like that unless something caused it. That tunnel was brought down." But when they tried to present the findings, the city moved quickly. Evidence was seized under the claim of public safety review. An injunction was filed against Lisa's publication, citing ongoing investigations. "They're trying to bury it again," Lisa said, her hands shaking. Turner clenched his fists. "Not this time." They met with families privately, showing them what they had uncovered. The reaction was heartbreak, mixed with fury. Maria Ortiz broke down in tears. Helen Doyle remained silent for a long time, then whispered, "I knew it. All these years I knew." But the truth came at a cost. That week, Turner's car was vandalized. Windows smashed, tires slashed. A typed note left on the seat read, "This ends now." Lisa's apartment was broken into. Nothing stolen, just papers shuffled, files moved. It was a warning. She called Turner that night, her voice brittle. "They're watching us." "Then we're getting close," he said. They decided to protect the data. Copies were made and stored in multiple places, drives hidden, documents mailed to trusted sources. Lisa reached out to national journalists. Turner contacted federal labor investigators off the record. One name kept surfacing, Marcus Dillard, MD from Eleanor's notes. He had once worked for Brennan and Hollis as a legal consultant and was known for managing problem sites. After the collapse, he vanished from public view, but reappeared years later in various government-adjacent contracting firms. Lisa traced him to a private residence outside Harrisburg. A quiet, gated property, registered under a shell corporation. They couldn't approach him, not yet, but now they had a face, a person behind the silence. Turner looked over the board, the connections, the timeline, the files. "This was never just about cost-cutting," he said. "It was about liability. They knew the risks, they knew the structure was compromised. And instead of fixing it, they buried it, along with 15 men. Lisa's eyes stayed fixed on the wall. "And now the world's going to know." The storm they'd stirred had grown beyond their control, but so had the truth. It was no longer a question of discovery. It was a question of who would have the strength to face it, and Turner had already made his choice. The article dropped on a Monday morning. This time it wasn't just local. Lisa's story, sealed in the tunnel where 15 men were left to die, hit national headlines. She included everything: the evidence from Eleanor's archives, Turner's findings inside the tunnel, the photos of the scratched message, the name Marcus Dillard, and the family's testimonies. By noon, the story had gone viral. News vans parked outside City Hall, Protesters gathered with signs that read, "Dig them up, we remember," and "Justice for the 15." Relatives who had remained silent for decades stepped forward, voices trembling but clear. Maria Ortiz gave an interview in front of the tunnel site, holding up her brother's photo. "My brother wasn't forgotten. He was buried." There's a difference. The city responded with a press conference. The mayor stood flanked by lawyers and aides, his words carefully chosen. "We understand the pain these revelations have caused," he said. "We are launching an internal inquiry into the collapse and reviewing the decisions made at that time." Turner watched the broadcast from his apartment, arms crossed, jaw tight. He heard what wasn't being said. There was no admission of guilt, no apology, only a stall tactic dressed as concern. Lisa called him moments later. "They're spinning it. They're going to bury it under red tape." "Then we don't stop," Turner replied. But with the spotlight came consequences. Lisa's paper received legal threats from multiple directions. Anonymous emails flooded her inbox, some demanding she retract, others laced with veiled threats. At night her phone rang, and no one spoke. Turner, too, felt the noose tightening. A notice arrived stating he was under investigation for unauthorized access to a sealed crime scene. His pension was put on hold. They met at a cafe outside the city, heads low, voices quieter than usual. "We're not safe," Lisa said. "I know," Turner replied, "but the story's not ours anymore, it's theirs now." They weren't wrong. Across the state, people demanded action, petition drives, letter campaigns, and public forums filled with angry voices. A retired worker came forward with documents he'd hidden for years, original inspection reports doctored before submission. A whistleblower from the mayor's office leaked emails revealing plans to discredit Lisa's article before it was even published. The tide was turning. Slowly, but undeniably. At night, Turner stood at the edge of the old construction site, now surrounded by yellow tape and police barriers. A makeshift memorial had appeared, flowers, candles, helmets placed gently on the ground. Someone had scrawled in red paint on the barrier, "We see you now." Lisa joined him there, her voice hushed. "They're listening." Turner nodded. "Then let's make sure they don't forget." The silence that had once protected the lie was cracking under the weight of truth. And with each voice that joined the call, the tunnel stopped being a forgotten grave. It became a symbol. Not just of what was lost, but of what still needed to be found. The knock on Lisa's door came just after sunset. She opened it cautiously, her breath catching at the sight of the woman before her. Eleanor Hayes stood with a cane in one hand and a file folder tucked under her arm. Her face was older, thinner, but her eyes, those sharp, steady eyes, had lost none of their fire. "I changed my mind," she said. "If this is the end of the line, I want to be the one who finishes it." Lisa stepped aside without a word. Eleanor sat slowly at the kitchen table, exhaling like someone unburdening a secret she'd carried too long. "I kept this hidden for years," she began, placing the folder between them. "It's everything I couldn't publish. Original interviews, notes, copies of city memos, the real story." Turner arrived minutes later, eyes widening as he saw her. "You're Eleanor Hayes," she nodded. "The last time I saw your badge, I was being warned not to speak. This time I'm choosing to." The documents she handed over were devastating. Letters from workers who had warned supervisors about unsafe conditions. Internal memos from Brennan and Hollis admitting the tunnel had shifted structurally, but choosing to proceed. Financial records connecting Dillard to off-the-books payouts, hush money for silence. One memo chilled them both. Dated 2 days before the collapse, it read, "If support fails before reinforcements arrive, initiate SEAL. PR risk unacceptable, losses containable." Turner slammed the table. They knew and sealed the damn tunnel anyway. Eleanor's voice cracked. "I tried to stop it, but no one would print the truth. The paper was under pressure. My editor was offered a job with a federal contractor 2 weeks after pulling the piece. I lost everything, my career, my friends, my peace, but I never forgot." Lisa reached across the table and touched Eleanor's hand. "You didn't fail. You just weren't finished." Later that night, Turner sat alone with the documents, rereading the names of men he never knew, names that had been turned into footnotes. He imagined them beneath the earth, realizing help wasn't coming, scratching a final message into stone. The next morning, they brought the evidence to the federal investigators who had quietly reopened the case. Turner laid the file on the table. This is the rest of the story, the part they tried to erase. The agents reviewed the documents in silence. One of them, a woman with a background in occupational safety law, looked up and said, "This changes everything." They opened a formal inquiry that afternoon. Subpoenas were issued. Marcus Dillard's name appeared on the first list. When Lisa told Eleanor, she smiled faintly. Let them finally answer to the voices they buried. The news broke before sunset. This time the city couldn't spin it. The truth was no longer in whispers. It was roaring, and no one could pretend they hadn't heard. The hearings began in early fall, held in a packed federal courtroom lined with reporters, victims' families, and curious onlookers. At the center of it all stood Marcus Dillard, gray-haired, expressionless, flanked by lawyers. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a man who had built a life on silence. Lisa sat in the front row, her notepad balanced on her knee. Turner stood against the back wall, arms folded, watching every word, every glance. Testimonies poured in. Former city employees, union reps, even a retired fire chief who confirmed that rescue orders had been pulled before attempts were complete. The most damning moment came when a federal investigator read aloud the memo recovered from Eleanor's files. If support fails, initiate SEAL. PR risk unacceptable. Gasps rippled through the room. Dillard's lawyers objected, but the judge allowed it into evidence. Helen Doyle was called to speak. She stepped slowly to the front, hands shaking but voice clear. "They told us it was a collapse," she said, "but it was a burial. My husband wasn't killed by nature. He was silenced by greed." Maria Ortiz followed. Her voice cracked only once. "All we wanted was the truth. We waited 35 years for someone to care." Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere shifted. News outlets across the country reported on the hearing. Documentaries were pitched. Civil suits were filed. Dillard refused to speak. He invoked his right against self-incrimination, but silence, once his weapon, was now his cage. The Department of Labor announced plans to open investigations into historical job site corruption. Congress members called for stricter whistleblower protections and reforms in infrastructure transparency. At the memorial site near the tunnel entrance, a new plaque was unveiled. It bore the names of all 15 men. Below them, a line carved in clean brass. They were not forgotten. They were found. Turner stood beside Lisa as the crowd gathered, many holding candles despite the afternoon sun. His eyes scanned the faces, some tearful, some proud, some still angry. "You did it," Lisa whispered. Turner shook his head. "We did it. And so did they. Eleanor. The families. Everyone who refused to let go." As the ceremony ended, he looked down at the plaque, one hand brushing the edge. He thought of Sammy Ortiz and Frank Doyle, of men who'd gone to work and never returned, of a city that chose silence and the people who shattered it. This wasn't just about closure, it was about recognition, about dignity stolen and finally restored. And somewhere beneath the concrete, the tunnel was still there. But it was no longer a grave, it was a reminder that the truth, no matter how deep it's buried, will rise. Months had passed since the hearings. The city had changed, not in its skyline or traffic or rhythm, but in something deeper. A silence had been broken, and the echoes still lived in every corner. Turner walked slowly through Fairmount Cemetery, following a path of autumn leaves that crunched beneath his feet. Ahead, a new monument stood, granite, simple, unadorned except for 15 engraved names. Someone had placed a bouquet at its base. A small note was tucked into the ribbon. "You were never just workers, you were our fathers, our brothers, our heroes." He stood for a long time, hands in his coat pockets, the wind brushing through his hair. He didn't need to speak. Some truths don't ask for words. Lisa waited near the gate. When he returned, she smiled. "They're naming the bill after them. The Doyle-Ortiz Labor Transparency Act, it passed this morning." Turner raised his eyebrows. "No ceremony?" She shook her head. Just a press release, quiet, but it's real. He nodded. That's how change starts. Eleanor couldn't make it to the ceremony. Her health had declined, but she'd sent a letter that Lisa read aloud at the dedication. It ended with a single sentence. The truth cannot be sealed forever. Turner had returned to the force, not full-time, but as an advisor on cold cases. He worked fewer hours now, often mentoring younger detectives. The badge no longer felt like a weight. It felt like purpose. Lisa's story had won her a national award, but she never let it become a headline about herself. She spoke instead about the families, the evidence, the resilience of people who never gave up. The tunnel itself remained closed, a permanent memorial zone. No plans to demolish or rebuild, just quiet, undisturbed ground. But every year on the anniversary, families gathered at the site, not to mourn, but to remember. One afternoon, as Turner walked past the city's newsstand, he saw a boy pointing at a framed photo in the window, 15 black and white portraits. "That's my grandpa," the boy said proudly. He helped build the tunnel. Turner kept walking, a quiet smile on his face. Before we close this chapter, if this story moved you, subscribe to the channel for more mysteries that reveal truths hidden for decades. And don't miss the next video suggested on your screen. It will take you even deeper into America's forgotten history. Some stories sleep, others wait. This one endured. And now it belongs to all of us.